Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then we consider what you know of the news of the day. Now, as of 2019, about 85% of forests in Peninsular Malaysia were permanent reserve forests, or better known as PRFs. Now, this is just a classification, though, and one that can be revoked or degazetted at any point in time, which is the state government. Now, tonight on the show, we're going to be looking at what drives deforestation or conservation in Peninsular Malaysia. Lau Yaohua is a science journalist for Macaranga, which is a portal covering issues of the environment and sustainability in Malaysia. He joins us now. Yaohua, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, Macaranga has this amazing in-depth series titled Forest Files, in which you examine the changes in forest use in Peninsular Malaysia, where you say that more forests were lost in the last 30 years if compared to in East Malaysia. Now, maybe you can begin by putting that into context for us. Just how much forest, Yaohua, has been lost in Peninsular Malaysia, and how quickly has that forest loss been observed?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me, Melissa and Sharaad. So yeah, you're right. So, we often think of East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak, having more forest loss than in Peninsular Malaysia, right? At least that is what is often portrayed or emphasized in the media. But when I started looking at the official data for forest area, and comparing just Peninsular Malaysia to East Malaysia, let's look at the last 30 years. So since 1990. Peninsular Malaysia itself, according to official forest area data, we have lost about 540,000 hectares of forest. So 540,000 hectares. Now, to put that in context, that's the area, if you add Taman Negara, the whole of Taman Negara, and then the Royal Belum State Park, if you add those two huge parks together, you get more or less about 550,000. So since in the last 30 years, we have lost forest area in Peninsular Malaysia, equivalent to a Taman Negara and the Royal Belum add together. But that sounds bad, right? And I think it's not great news. And the overall forest area in Peninsular Malaysia is about 43% now. But to take it, if we want to find a silver lining, the rate of deforestation has decreased. It has slowed down a lot, since 1990, if you compare it to like the 70s or the 80s or the 60s. So I guess that's the good news among, unfavorable news.
Yaohua, but is it any surprise then, because of urbanization, because the population is increasing and there's more pressure to open up land for our residents or for for industry? Is this actually an unusual rate of deforestation, much more than would have been anticipated?
Well, I do not know how much is anticipated, right? And you are right. So very often and it's true that we need to open up land for development. But I guess we can also think of what is the best use of land, whether to leave it as forest or must we really develop every land. I mean, even if you look around in Klang Valley, there are many areas of land that are open and left vacant. And, do we really need more condos that are not sold? So that's one question. But the other way to look at it is how much forest is sufficient? Are we losing too much? I'm not in a position to answer that. I think that's a very scientific and also economic and also social question to really be examined. But it's good to bear in mind that the Malaysian government, the federal government, has sort of made a promise to keep our forest area at 50%, and Peninsular Malaysia itself is at 43% already, although the whole country is still around 54%.
Okay. Yaohua, now, one of the things that I learned reading the in-depth series by Macaranga, and that's something that I didn't know, was that actually Malaysia has sustainable forestry policies going back decades, going back to the 1970s. How is it that we have sustainable forestry policies and yet we're seeing so much forest loss?
Yeah, indeed, that's very often something that we often do not know, right? When we think logging, we think of like clear cutting, but actually most of the logging done in Malaysia and in Peninsular Malaysia is actually what we call sustainable logging. So, if you look in Peninsular Malaysia, about 86% of the forest that we see in Peninsular Malaysia is categorized as permanent reserve forest. And within permanent reserve forest, the only logging that can be done is sustainable logging. By and large, it's only that. That means no clear cutting, and then the forestry department will come in and then they will tag, certain trees that can be logged and which trees cannot be logged. So it's all sustainable. The deforestation that I mentioned just now, that 500 over 1,000 hectares lost, those are not sustainable logging. In fact, those probably can't even be considered forestry because those are changes in the land use itself. It used to be forest. Officially the land is forest. Its land use is forest, and then the state government removed it. Made it not as a forest use. So then there's not even sustainable logging there. So sustainable logging does not matter when it comes to that 540,000 hectares lost there. Yeah.
Yahua, can I ask you if all land, as it were, is equivalent? Meaning, are there areas that are ecologically unique or important because of the what they provide? Say, for instance, mangroves.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, mangroves.
People of is important, but are core to fisheries. They're core to the fertilization of fruit trees and all that because of the bats and so on. Can you explain to us? I mean, where is it that we're losing, which is actually quite detrimental? It has a knock-on effect beyond the local loss of forest.
Well, I think most of the forest loss are lowland forests, and those are the easiest to lose. So we have lost actually most of those. What remains now is much of it in Peninsular Malaysia, at least, is hillland forests. So those on a higher elevation, and they are more on a slope. So they are always harder to log, and not easy to build buildings on, not easy to develop. So they are more or less, slightly safer now. But back to your question, yeah, mangroves for sure, and they're still losing mangroves. I would say mangroves is really important and unique because you cannot, if you cut a lowland forest, you can still reforest another piece of lowland, and after decades of you don't disturb it, after decades you take proper care of it, it can still become a proper functioning forest. But mangrove is very hard to reforest. We have been trying very hard. We plant thousands, hundreds of thousands of mangrove saplings, but a lot of those die. So mangroves are almost, I don't know, it's just very hard to replicate, to reforest mangroves, and they serve all these unique ecosystem functions from habitat for fishes, for prawns, and as barrier to protect our coastlands. So all of that. So that, I don't understand why we are still losing mangroves. If we are going to protect any forest, it's really mangroves that we should protect, but we are still losing them. Yeah.
I understand the importance of that diverse ecosystem. Yahua, coming back a little bit to, as you said, permanent reserve forests, which is a classification that is controlled solely by state governments. I'm just wondering, in the way that's been de-gazetted or declassified by some states, how states think about forests versus, say, as you mentioned, sustainable logging versus declassifying it for development purposes. What trends are you observing?
What trends am I observing? Well, truth be told, the state governments have authority over all land, not just permanent reserve forests. They have authority over all land. And they have been de-gazetting more forests than they have been gazetting land in forests, because they can do the opposite too. They can turn a non-forest use land into forest use. And what we have seen is, so there are different types. So permanent reserve forest is one type, and those are more or less protected in a way. But then there's also another type called state land forest. So these are forests on land that is designated for development, right? So now in Peninsular Malaysia, we have about 240,000 hectares of state land forest. Those have definitely been decreasing on a decreasing trend. Those have never increased, and we do not expect them to increase because they would be developed. But in terms of the PRF, actually, they have been increasing in some states. Pahang, for example, has actually increased its permanent reserve forest. Johor has decreased its permanent reserve forest by a lot, and I'm talking in in terms of the last 30 years. So I'm not going to make interpretation on what the different state governments think of their land, but if you just think if you would decrease a protected forest area, you take it out and then you develop it. I guess that goes to show that the state government values it for development purpose. They're thinking in terms of land revenue, in terms of timber revenue, the first clear cut, then after that you can develop it. And that's all very often we hear the reason that's used, that the forest becomes what they call degraded and hutan miskin. And then they give the reason that, it's already degraded forest. Now it's better if we just, clear it for development. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually hoping to ask you to, in fact, rate the various states. But
I'm not going to do that.
Don't want to do that. Okay, let's put it this way. Kelantan has had some really bad press about forest and deforestation. The flooding is related to it. We've had encroachment on Orang Asli customary land. We have had, any number of conflicts because of land. Where do you think, what is the dynamics? Are we looking at business and political collusion? I mean, between state governments and business interests that are really driving the deforestation dynamics in many of the states? Who are the bad boys, as it were, of deforestation?
Whether they are bad boys or not is open to interpretation, but definitely the group of people who have the ultimate power to change land use from forest to non-forest, to say that this piece of land is permanent reserve forest or is state land forest or is whatever residential or whatever other purposes, that would be the state government, the state exco, and then the leader of the state exco will of course be the Menteri Besar. Now all these changes in the PRF status, right, has to be gazetted. It means it has to be announced by the state government in a legal document called the Gazette. And the Gazette, as I understood it, is issued and approved and signed by the chief minister. So if we want to talk about either whether it's political dynamics or in whose interest, of course it could be in the national interest, but then it really all boils down to the considerations of the powers that be. In this case, the state exco. If we drill down further, it will be the Menteri Besar. Yeah.
All right. So can I ask you, Yahya, very quickly then, are you optimistic that there are ways that we can potentially improve forest use in Peninsular Malaysia?
Yeah, there are ways. There are definitely ways. Am I optimistic? I was very optimistic last year, actually, when I was doing this story.
What's changed?
I was optimistic because there were, since, last year, there were talks about amendments, right, to the National Forestry Act, and the amendments the amendments have been in the works for like a decade or so, but it was in 2019. So these amendments are two. The two main amendments, the two meaningful ones, are that every time the state government wants to change or de-gazette permanent reserve forest, they need to hold a public consultation, like what is happening in Selangor, right? Selangor is the only state now that requires that step of public consultation. So if the state government wants to de-gazette the permanent reserve forest, they actually have to speak to the stakeholders. They have to listen to the stakeholders first, get their opinion, and then act later, right? It's not that they must listen to, they must act according to those opinions, of course, but at least there's a public consultation, and the public are able to voice their concerns, and they know that the gazettement is going to happen. So that's the first proposed amendment. The second one is that it's what we call a simultaneous replacement, which means that every time a de-gazettement happens, the state government must at the same time replace the de-gazetted area with another forest area of the same size, right? So they must do that at the same time. But those two, so I was very hopeful, but those two proposed amendments were rejected in the National Land Council meeting that was held on the end of January, just 2 months ago.
Right.
So now I'm very pessimistic. Yeah.
Oh dear. All right. Well,
Yeah.
Yahua, thank you for alerting us to these changes. So we'll keep a close eye on any future developments. But thank you for your time and joining us on the show tonight. We appreciate it. We're going to take a quick break here on the show. More on this specific issue in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our examination of the dynamics and the mechanics of forest use changes in Peninsular Malaysia. Teck Wyn Lim joins us now. He's the Managing Director of Resource Stewardship Consultants, a scientific research and environmental consultancy with expertise in the spheres of forestry, wildlife, and climate legislation. Teck Wyn, thank you for joining us on the show. I'd like to begin our conversation looking at the issue of degazettement of the Kuala Lumpur. I'm wondering what dynamics strike you the most in this push by the Selangor State Government to degazette this particular piece of permanent reserve forest?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mel, for highlighting this issue. It's rather disturbing because it's happening in a state which had, up until recently, actually very encouraging forest policy in that they had put a moratorium on all logging inside forest reserves. And the state government had actually come out giving a commitment that they would not degazette any areas apart from very few circumstances, such as like building a highway. But in this case, there seems to be some pressures behind the Menteri Besar in the sense that this land is worth so much, it's worth billions because it's in the Klang Valley. And so the Menteri Besar, up until today, still seems to be ignoring public opinion and seems to be committed to push ahead with this degazettement.
Teck Wyn, I mean, I know these are difficult conversations because when people have tiptoed around the stakeholders behind this push, that include the Royal House, and I think that has made it very difficult for pushback. But do you see this? I mean, how do you see this? I mean, the collusion between state actors, business interests, some of whom might actually be part of our institutional framework.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's difficult, as you say, to mention because of the connection with royalty and the sensitivities regarding the politics and the connection between politics and the royalty. And so, in the sense of if you look at the politics of Selangor in particular, the Istana has actually been really influential in picking the Menteri Besar. And so you can imagine how the Menteri Besar doesn't really want to annoy the Istana. However, I would say that it strikes right at the heart of this issue of how we as a nation are dealing with the issue of the monarchy, in the sense that Selangor is not alone in facing the pressures by the royal institutions to assert themselves when it comes to land and when it comes to forests. And this is something which Yahua talked about a bit earlier, in the sense that the states have autonomy in terms of forests, and it's one of the few areas where the states can actually get a large amount of income, and so this is one of the areas where there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the politicians to, I think the political scientists call it patronage, and it's basically rewarding their cronies, but it's also keeping the powers that be happy. And I think we could talk a lot about this, but it is so controversial that I'm not sure how we could do this in a way which doesn't land us all into trouble. Yeah.
Well, to take with then, are there any, to the best of your knowledge, are there any checks and balances put in place to ensure that, that best practices or, sustainable forestry policies that were put in place before actually are working, doing what they were meant to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in fact, Selangor is, in the whole of the peninsula, has the best checks and balances in terms of deforestation, because there is a requirement that the public be consulted before the forest reserve is excised. And Selangor is the only state in the peninsula that has that requirement. But it seems that despite that, the state is pushing ahead. So it was almost as if the public hearing was just a formality, and the decision had already been made. Now, the other level of checks and balance that has also been tested is whether or not the Dewan as a whole can overturn the decision of the Executive Council. And this is actually quite encouraging in that there was a member of the Dewan, this YB Najwan, who came out and put forward a motion that I understand was passed unanimously by the Dewan, saying that they shouldn't go ahead with this excision. And so this strikes me as there's a parallel in Johor, somewhat parallel in Johor, in that there was a case a couple of years ago when it was announced that one of the national parks, the Pulau Kukup National Park, was de-gazetted. And then there was a public uproar, and the Dewan passed a resolution, and unfortunately that caused the executive to overturn their decision. Now, in this case, it seems that the resolution of the Dewan in Selangor was non-binding. And so if the MB decides to go ahead, it will really be up to the Dewan to come up with something stronger, a stronger resolution. But apart from that, I can't think of any other checks and balances apart from actually voting the present government out of power.
That's very interesting, because you do point to a kind of revolt by backbenchers. I do want to ask you, though, and we can move on to what is embedded in this particular problem, which is governance structures. And Malaysia has been bequeathed, this federal system. We know that, we have some really far-sighted policies. It's come up many times. The Central Forest Spine Master Plan, created in 2009, is seen as a way of thinking through the ecological realities and challenges. But they fail because of the governance structures that we have. I mean, is there any way around this? I mean, is there any political will you see to address this particular problem?
Yeah, there's some really interesting and encouraging developments. The last government came up with this scheme called an ecological fiscal transfer, which basically means the federal government paying off the states to save some of the forests. And the current government is actually continuing it. And so this is, you mentioned Kelantan earlier, this is a case where first time in a long time, the same party in power at the federal level and the state level in terms of Kelantan, with the Tuan Ibrahim, the Minister of Environment, being from PAS. And so what I hope to see happening, and it is happening but fairly slowly, is that the federal government is going to be allocating more and more money to give to the states as a form of compensation for the fact that the states are conserving part of the land. And so that's something I would say that the original allocation was only about 60 million, and I would be quite interested to see that increase. And then cases like Kelantan and Kedah are all obvious choices, because these are relatively poor states, and in comparison with the tremendous economic power that the federal government bears, they will be able to, it's a drop in the ocean for the federal government to be able to pay the state a few million to conserve some of these natural heritage, which are really priceless.
Right. I mean, Teck Wyn, if you could help us identify areas where we see real threats to either our ecological heritage or unique areas. I'm thinking sometimes we read these headlines like the December rare earth find in Kedah, and there's great enthusiasm to dig up and mine everything in sight for this billion-dollar treasure. And because we saw the tragedy of bauxite mining in Kuantan, in Pahang, a couple of years ago. Where do you think the next disaster is going to emerge in the peninsula?
All right, so it's all over the place, yeah. But the place that you mentioned first, the state of Kedah, was actually the one I thought of first as well, because the part of the area where they're talking about these rare earth mines in Kedah is Ulu Muda. And Ulu Muda is famous as a water catchment area for the rice basins of the Lower Muda, but also as an important source of water for Penang. And this is actually the area where the federal government should step in, because rather than make Penang and Kedah fight each other over who's going to pay for the water, the federal government needs to come in, pay off Kedah, and make sure that the water supply to Penang is not jeopardized by these kind of projects.
I mean, sorry, go ahead,
Sharaad. No, you go ahead, Sharaad.
Well, there's a very tense argument about shared responsibilities. And I've had this argument with just ordinary people in Penang who seem to think that they don't or share in the responsibility for the protection of Ulu Muda. And I wonder if, because we talked about states, we talked about business and the avarice and so on and so forth, but what about the public? Does the public truly understand the cost of protecting our environment?
Well, the ratepayers, from their point of view, they're already paying money for their water, and if you ask them to pay more, then of course they would be reluctant to do so. But
they pay very little. I mean, it's a very low cost. Water is very cheap in Penang, as it is in much of the peninsula.
Well, that's right. I would say, however, that Penang water system there has been well run, and so they have managed to make it profitable. But as you point out, that's largely due to the fact that they're more or less getting a free supply of water from Kedah.
Teck Wyn, I'm so sorry to have to interrupt you, but we have run out of time on the show. It's a conversation we will aim to pick up again in another episode, but thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate your time. That's all we have for you in this edition of Consider This. Don't forget to get all the latest news on COVID-19 vaccines on astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Good night.